Okay, here we see a depiction of the Sun King Louis the 14th. He was called as the Sun King, meaning that he was like the embodiment of the vital energy of the state, like just as the sun is vital for the world, he was vital for the state, and he embodied all the power, all the authority of the state, a centralization of the state. But of course, this meant that other institutions or other power centers could not really grow against the power of the monarchy, and the monarchy grew and in contravention, let's say, of the development of a system of checks and balances. Here we also see a modern, of course, picture, I mean today's picture of the Versailles Palace, where the king resided together with his family, and also all the aristocrats that were in the court chamber, and all the activities, daily activities of the state also took place in this new center, the Versailles Palace. Um, Again, looking at the overall historical development of the state, we can talk about a few traits, a few characteristics of state building. One, as we noted before, is a centralizing tradition. The state wants to concentrate power in its own hands, and there is a tendency not to distribute power or not to allocate power to either the regions or to other political centers of authority. So the state has a central role. It was the state building process, so it's not the building of a federal structure, but it's the building of a centralized political authority. Social advancement determined by office holding in the state. So what meant a social role, a prominent social role, was mostly associated with a powerful position either in the bureaucracy or in the military. So rather than, for example, engaging in, let's say, an trade or industrialization, an office such as a production, a trade office, a trade, let's say, professions associated with the state acquired an important role in terms of social advancement. So it would be, let's say, the elites would mostly be made up of people who had important roles in the bureaucracy or in the military. Another important characteristic was sense of fragility of national unity and impermeability of borders. So here again, there was a sort of apprehension, a tension associated with losing national unity. Okay, so we may be susceptible to outside interventions. We may be susceptible to, let's say, threats against national unity, because our borders can be easily transgressed. I mean, we don't have very firm borders, especially in the north and the east of the country. So this also created a sense of impermeability of borders, permeability of borders. Then geographical and cultural diversity. Here again, we have considerable geographical and cultural diversity. There is a sort of a saying which was attributed to Charles de Gaulle, one of the former presidents of the French Republic, and also the, let's say, architect of the Fifth Republic, French Republic, with a new constitution, the semi-presidential regime of France that is also currently in operation. So Charles de Gaulle is attributed this proverb. He is accounted as saying the following. So he said that France is a country that has a rich diversity of cheeses. So there are a lot of different cheeses, like Camembert, for example, is a famous French cheese. So similar to Camembert, there were also some other very famous cheeses that was attributed to France, and he said that it's very hard to govern a country with that high a number of different cheese varieties. So how can you govern a country that has, I don't know the number exactly, but that has 364 different varieties of cheese. So having these different varieties of cheese was used to denote the differences in terms of the specificities, cultural differences between the regions of the country. So this may also, let's say, explain the very important role given to a centralized state authority. Because there is a lot of difference, standardization of the country under one center, under one political authority, was given a lot of importance. It was attached a very important prominence in the state building process. And another important feature is instability and frequent regime changes. So we have rather than the evolutionary progress of political life that we witnessed in the case of Britain, here we have abrupt changes, revolutions, a formation of empire, then turning into a republic, and then the monarchy being reinstated, etc. So there are abrupt regime changes, and there is instability, especially up until the Fifth Republic, especially during the Third and Fourth Republic. We have a lot of instability and problems, creating problems in governance of the country. So that's also another quite an hectic and not cooperative, not conciliatory, but quite conflictual political life can be witnessed, let's say, in the case of France's state building process. Political culture. When we look at the political culture, first of all, we may talk about the important role of the church. There was a very close relationship, let's say, between the monarchy and the Catholic Church. However, there is also a strong tradition of anti-clericalism, especially during the Enlightenment. We have a lot of questions being asked about the monarchy and the important power, the privileges of the church. There was growing criticism and resentment against the church, especially the clergy that actually were very much close to authority, that were very much close to the monarchy. So this also fueled the development of an anti-clerical, anti-clergy, anti-church movement. Republicans aim to curb church's powers by confiscating their property and withdrawing their privileges. So the church also had a lot of land, a lot of possessions, material possessions, and also they had privileges like opening schools, also engaging in some commercial activity because they had so much property. So during the Republican era, some of these powers were confiscated, and the privileges of the church were limited, withdrawn. And church, as a result of these, they say, impingements on its own authority, on its own privileges, became mostly reactionary, meaning mostly attached to the monarchy, to the traditional order, to a more hierarchical order, and they became critical of the Republican movement in France. French laicite, usually we use the term secularism mostly when we talk about the case of Anglo-Saxon systems like the United States or Britain, where there is a more of a coexistence between religion and the state. But here, in the case of France, we use the French term for this, laïcité, to denote the relationship between the church and the state. So here there is a clear separation between the church and the state, in order to also maybe get rid of this link between the close link between the church and the monarchy. So here we have the state, which is mostly based on secular ideas, mostly on secular authority, and which does not really contain any reference to religion. Religion is organized separately from the state. There is a clear separation. For example, let's say in especially countries with a secular tradition, like Britain maybe, or some of the other countries in Western Europe, in their state establishment, there may be small, let's say, chapels, for example. Let's say in their consulates, there may be small chapels which is devoted to some sort of religious ceremony. But in the case of France, for example, because of this very strict separation between church and the state, the religious symbols or religious ceremonies in state establishment is prohibited. So you cannot have a cross, for example, uh, in a state office, for example, let's say in a ministry. So there's a separation between the state establishment, the state institutions, and the religious institutions. And monarchy, because of the, as we said, strong link between the monarchy and the Catholic Church, the reactionary movement is mostly related with the continuation of the privileges of the church, whereas the anti-clerical tradition is mostly related with the republican tradition. They also are against both the monarchy, the preservation of the monarchy, and also preservation of the, let's say, clerical privileges. French patriotism. Again, France is usually seen as a country that has a strong sense of, let's say, pride in its own national identity, a patriotism, let's say, being proud of France, its accomplishments, being proud of the intellectual tradition, being proud of the Marseillaise, the French Revolution, etc. However, again, there is also a strong polarization in the concept of French patriotism. So, what do we mean by being French? What are the common values that unite the French? So, this usually is different if you are on the right or the left of the political spectrum. So, if you are right wing, then what you see as associated with the French idea of patriotism is quite different if you were a leftist. So, for example, if you are a French patriot but on the right of the political spectrum, then you would have the idea of a powerful state. You would support a centralized bureaucratic tradition, and you would also have, let's say, maybe a much more an idea of social order which is based on hierarchy rather than equality, etc. But if you are looking at it from the left hand of the political spectrum, then you would mostly maybe focus on the experiences of France, especially the French Commune, for example, when there was like a self-government in Paris for a brief period of time, or the 1968 student revolts, etc. These would be more important for you in defining the French identity. You would also espouse these ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, citizenship based on equality, etc. And you would be against monarchy. You would be against the privileges of the monarchy, of the aristocracy or the clergy. So you would have a very different notion of what it means to be French. So this is also a point of contention between the different political groups and the political ideologies in France. Resentment to rule and search for freedom, as well as emphasis on order and reason. And also, it is said in terms of the political culture of the country that there is a climate of mistrust among people. There have been some studies about trust in societies, and it was found that, for example, the level of trust between people, uh, fellow citizens, whether you trust them or whether you have a certain sense of suspicion towards others, there was a high level of trust, especially in northern European countries and Scandinavian countries, and also in countries like Japan, but especially in southern Europe, including France. What was found out was that people mistrusted each other. They had a sense of suspicion. The others was something that they didn't really like to engage very much. So they wanted to keep as much as possible away from the others. And usually provincial, regional identities were much more important than a more, let's say, a generalized French sense of belonging together. So um, on the macro level, maybe we had this idea of France unity, state, the French state, the idea of being French, pride in being French. But underneath that, we also see a high level of mistrust among the different cultural identities and regional identities in France. In 1789, of course, we had the famous French Revolution, which was not only an important event for French history, but it was also a very important event in terms of world history as well. And the ideas of the French Revolution were very influential in, especially, for example, our country as well, in any kind of struggle against monarchy, in any kind of struggle to limit the power of the monarchy. Maybe ideas of the French Revolution and lessons of the French Revolution played a very important role. So it had a lot of importance in developments, political developments in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Again, there is also a quite, I think, interesting anecdote. During the Maoist era in China, after the Second World War, Mao's prime minister was again an influential politician. His name was Zhou Enlai, and he was asked a question by one of the journalists. He was asked to explain his ideas, to give his ideas about the French Revolution. So he was asked, "What do you think of the French Revolution? Do you think it was important? How do you view the lessons of the French Revolution?" And he answered, and he said that, "Well, I can't say anything at the moment because it is too early to tell. It's been just 2 centuries since the French Revolution, and still early to tell." So this is usually cited as an anecdote to say that, of course, sometimes it may be too. Of course, it's not really too early because a lot of time has passed since the French Revolution, but still we are still maybe in the process of commenting on, in the process of processing, assessing the effects of the French Revolution. So here, what was very important, both for the political developments in France and in Europe, also in general, was that the French Revolution was very important. It was an act of popular revolt against the monarchy and the ideas of popular sovereignty. People actually embodying sovereignty against, let's say, let's say assertion that monarchs have the divine right to rule. Now the idea of popular sovereignty, popular rule, became much more legitimate, let's say, after the French Revolution. The ideas of equality based on citizenship, that if you are a citizen, you are not just a subject of the king, but you have rights against the monarchy or against the ruler, and you are equal. All citizens have equal rights against the government, against the state, and against each other. So this is also an important principle, both to ascertain the liberty of individuals and also to protect them against any infringement of their rights by the authoritarian institutions. Of course, as we said, liberty, equality, fraternity were the three important concepts, like the motto, which were propagated by the French Revolution and then became the common principles of the Republican tradition in France. The Enlightenment process, which started at the end of the maybe 1600s and especially during the 1700s, was a very influential movement, an intellectual movement which criticized the traditional institutions such as the monarchy, religion, the church, and the privileges associated with the church. So they rejected the scholastic world of the Middle Ages, the medieval period, the feudal structures, the monarch's power, privileges, etc., and they basically laid down the vision of a new world order, which was based on the predominance of the human mind, logic, reason, the important role of the state, that the science should be our guidance. We shouldn't look to religious clerics or religious figures, but to scientists in order to show us the way forward. So there was a belief in positive science, that science can be the cure of everything, the solution to all humanity's problems, and there was a belief in progress. So we will, if we have science as our guide, then we will achieve and advance in newer and more advanced stages of human civilization. And especially in the case of France, mostly there was an insistence which was also based on Descartes' let's say philosophy and his approach to science, a Cartesian logic, which basically was based on human reason, and by mostly cognitive abilities you can approach the truth, and you can also approach all social and also natural events and phenomena by using this Cartesian logic. In contrast, in the case of Britain, mostly empiricism was more preponderant, especially, for example, when we look at John Locke. We see an empiricist approach to science, mostly based on observation of natural phenomena. They were arriving at certain, let's say, hypotheses, certain scientific truths. But in this case, logic, the use of logic was more important. We had especially three important philosophers, writers that actually influenced the Enlightenment era, and their ideas, their observations, their assessments were very important also in triggering maybe developments that led to the French Revolution and the very abrupt radical change in political authority structures in France. They were Voltaire, Baron de Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Voltaire, his real name was François-Marie Arouet, and he lived between 1694 and 1778. Then we had Baron Montesquieu between 1689 and 1755, and then we had another very influential philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, between 1712 and 1778. So here we see also their, let's say, pictures, paintings, let's say, that depicted these three important philosophers. Here we see Voltaire. Down here we have Baron Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Voltaire again was maybe the most well known. He's one of the most cited philosophers of the Enlightenment. He was against the Catholic Church. He was very much critical of the old institutions, both the monarchy and the Catholic Church, and he challenged the old wisdom, the old way of doing things, the old thoughts, the old ideas, the old system. So he was one of the pioneers of a change in outlook, a change in political philosophy, a change in political concepts, a change in the relations between the state and the citizen. He advocated human reason, that reason should be our guiding star. He was also a proponent of human rights and liberty. There is a saying which was attributed to him. This is also usually, again, people repeat this proverb, and they mostly, again, refer to Voltaire as the person who said it first. And he said that I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So this is basically respect for freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, freedom of speech. So I will fight for the freedom of expression of those who I don't agree with. So for example, I may be, let's say, a social democrat, the other person may be a conservative, and the conservative may talk about things which I don't agree with, but I will listen to that person, and I will also support his right to say what he thinks, because this is the basis of democracy, the basis of really free citizenship. Now we had Montesquieu, we talked, I think, about him before in our comparative government class also. He was the writer of one of the first books of comparative politics, The Spirit of the Laws. So he wrote about the British tradition, he wrote about the French tradition, he even had a book about the different political systems, and he talked about the differences both in culture and in political tradition, and he was well known for supporting separation of powers and checks and balances system. And another saying which is attributed to Montesquieu is that when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, there can be no liberty. So this is basically a point made in support of the separation of powers. So if you just give all the legislative and executive powers to the same person or the same institution, then you cannot talk about liberty. Then we have Rousseau. He wrote The Social Contract, and he talked about humans in a state of nature, and the role of the state and the role of the relationship between humans and state. So he said that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. So he thought that rather than, for example, the Hobbesian way of approaching the state of nature. He thought that humans are actually free in nature, and when they live in a state, they also sacrifice their freedom. So he said that the state should actually act for the common good of the society, and he brought about the concept of the general will, embodying the common good. So sometimes the state should act on the basis of this common good of the society, despite maybe not all the individuals in the society not supporting what the state is doing. So this gives also, let's say, sort of a concept, a new understanding of the role of the state, the role that the state should play. Okay, so we talked about the French Revolution and what were the developments, when we ask what were the developments that led to the French Revolution. On the one hand, we can talk about financial problems that led to the tension leading to the French Revolution. First of all, the budget of the state was in a critical condition, and the state did not have the means, let's say, to provide for the citizens. There was a near bankruptcy situation of near bankruptcy. French industry and agriculture was mostly used to state protectionism and favors by the state rather than, let's say, engaging in free market activities. So they were mostly very much attached to state, and they were clientelistic relations, let's say, between the French industry and agriculture and the state providing, let's say, some favors to these producers, let's say, in these sectors. Economic growth in the 19th century also, it was a destabilized regime. So in this theory, it is also said that when there is some form of economic development, starting of economic growth and economic development, this could be a factor that destabilizes the regime because it would increase the expectations of the citizenry, and the citizens would see that, for example, some groups are better off than they are. They can really benefit from this economic growth than they are. So this creates jealousy and resentment against the different social classes and social groups in the society, and it may fuel unrest, and also it may destabilize the society and the country. Again, we talked about the Enlightenment, the stress on liberty, rationality, and destruction of the old regime. So there was a lot of criticism of how things were run, and the old regime was seen as incompetent, corrupt, and not really worthy of governing the country. The legitimacy of the regime was put into question. Louis XVI decided to reform the political system but could not contain the change that already started in the society. And he wanted to make some reforms and, let's say, also address the expectations of the population for change of the old order. However, these were too little too late. He couldn't really fulfill the expectations of the population. He reconvened the Estat General for the first time since 1614. As we said, the former monarchs did not really regard this as an important political institution. They didn't convene, they didn't ask any questions, they didn't consult the Estat General. But now he reconvened this institution for the first time since 1614. In this Estate General, there were three estates, let's say, the clergy, the aristocracy, and there was also a third estate, which was mostly representative of the what was called as the commoners, but mostly made up of the bourgeois classes, the middle classes. And they wanted to meet together with the nobles and the clergy. They wanted the same rights with these other estates. And they also voted to turn the Estate General to a new national assembly. So they wanted a representation in the political system, more powers. They wanted to be listened to, they wanted to be consulted by the king, by the monarch. However, these expectations were not fulfilled. So what the monarch could offer did not fulfill their expectations. And on July the 14th, there was this very famous event, storming of the Bastille. The people mostly making up this third estate, they went to the Bastille and they stormed the Bastille. They let out all the prisoners in this prison, in the Bastille prison. And then the king's authority, of course, faltered. He was not able to suppress the revolt. And it was also said that he said that this was a revolt by the people, and he was going to suppress it. And one of the aristocrats in his let's say courtier in his court, he answered the king, and he said that my monarch, my king, you cannot say that this is a revolt, but this is a revolution. This is much more than that. So he was able to analyze what was going on more correctly than the king. And power was grasped, let's say, by the revolutionaries. And this was a class, a group, let's say, called the Jacobin, and they wanted to change the state. They wanted to seize the power and use it to change the state. And Robespierre was one of the prominent figures of these revolutionaries. And then for a period, there was what was called as a reign of terror, when very stark policies were implemented. This small culture of revolutionaries gained power, and they used it very violently. They wanted to suppress all the elements that they saw as against the revolution, especially the aristocrats. They were either sentenced to death, or they were forced to flee the country. They left their houses, their chateaus, all their belongings, and they lost their privileged positions. And later, it came to such a point that one of these revolutionaries, Danton, was actually tried by the revolutionary courts, and he was also sentenced to death by the guillotine. The guillotine was also invented as a device to realize this death sentences, let's say. And he has also an important, let's say, observation. He said, the revolution is now devouring its own children. So we are the children of the revolution. We are the revolutionaries. But now we have come to such a point that we are killing each other. The revolution is devouring its own children. And then at the end, those people who were very critical of Robespierre's reign of terror, at the end, they also were able to get a grip on Robespierre, and he was also beheaded in 1794. So here we see a picture which depicts these, let's say, sentencing to death by the guillotine. So there is a person that actually operates this guillotine, this device which beheads people, and then he shows the head of the person to the crowd, and the crowd cheers to this. So it was like the society has become so troubled, so fragmented, so polarized, that people were actually cheering the death of people who they saw as against the revolution. The king and the queen, Marie Antoinette, were also beheaded by the guillotine, and this was an end of an era for the French monarchy. Um, After the French Revolution, we also see that some cleavages and political and ideological divisions became more prominent in French society and politics. There were two important cleavages. One was the Parisian provincial divide, which may be also emanating from former centuries, not only since the French Revolution. So there was the people who were in the center of this new state, Parisians, and there were the people who were from the provinces. And the Parisians had a bit of a maybe a snobbish attitude, a patronizing attitude towards the provinces. They thought them as culturally, intellectually inferior to the Parisian heartland, the Parisian center. This created a cleavage. And then we had the royalist republican cleavage, people who supported the revolution, who supported the ideals of the republican, people who were critical of the revolution, critical of what the violence that was brought by the French Revolution, and they were still supportive of the royalists. In 1792, we had the establishment of the First Republic. However, it ended in turmoil, as we said, the Reign of Terror. And then during this period of instability, the army became the only institution that was able to establish some kind of order in the French society, and they were able to attain power over the state apparatus. Again, in 1938, a prominent, again, theoretician, Brinton, wrote about revolutions. So he, until that day, he talked about certain revolutions. He observed certain revolutions, especially the French Revolution, and he theorized about the stages a revolution, a political revolution, passes through. And he said that revolutions pass through similar stages. There is a first stage when the old regime loses effectiveness and legitimacy, so it becomes very much illegitimate, and there are a lot of criticisms from the population. There's a lot of discontent and jealousy, and as we said also in the case of the French Revolution, some form of economic development also can create more criticism toward the regime, because there are more expectations from the regime. There is also more resentment against other groups, and people think that some other groups that are closer to the state, or that have privileged positions vis-a-vis the state, can benefit from economic development while they cannot. So this creates again resentment and jealousy within the society. Then there is a political problem which may not be really important, but where the disagreements between the state authorities and the critical groups, let's say, those who are criticizing and who wants to grasp power from the political authorities, they come face to face over this political problem, and this political problem triggers anti-regime process and change of power. Then, in the second stage, moderates seize power in the initial phase of the revolution. They want to reform the regime, so they don't want to engage in an overhaul of the whole system, but they want to make sure that it functions more effectively. So they want to correct rather than changing in total all the regime. However, there are also some other extremist or radical segments within the revolutionaries, and they criticize these moderates, and they say that these moderates are cowards. They don't really know how to handle the situation, so we should grasp power, otherwise they will just give the power to the old, let's say, power holders, to the old monarch or the other old institutions. So the extremists take power from the moderates, and they totally dismantle the old regime. As in the case of the French Revolution, maybe a reign of terror will be prevalent, and all the old regime will be done away with. And then, following this early phase where the revolution is very extreme and very much adamant to destroying all the remains of the old regime, then we have a calming down period, which is called as the Thermidor, where there is some sort of maybe a return to the old ways, and there is a more of a mixture, an intermingling between the revolutionary, let's say, findings, the revolutionary gains, and the tradition. In 1799, we have the coup d'etat by Napoleon Bonaparte. Again, Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the most important, prominent political figures, political leaders in French history, and he left a lot of imprints. He left a lot of influence on the French state, especially in terms of in authority, centralizing authority, but also the administrative structure, the military structure of the country. So he left a lot of influence, and he was an officer from Corsica in the army. So he came from quite humble backgrounds, but he raised because mostly of his skills, let's say, he was quite a successful officer in the army, and during this time he was able to gain power. He engaged in a coup d'etat, and in 1804 he established the first empire. So he was actually crowned as the emperor, the French emperor. The republic was no longer on the agenda, but now we again have, instead of the monarch, we have an empire for France, and he engaged in a series of reforms in order to create a better functioning state. However, while doing that, he set up also a very strong intelligence, information gathering, sort of like a police state, which also, of course, suppressed liberties and freedoms in the society. He also engaged in a process of invasions. He opened battle. He sent his military forces. He sent his soldiers throughout Europe. However, a coalition which was led by Britain, led by the British forces, uh, aimed to suppress and aimed to limit the ascendance of Napoleon Bonaparte. So at the end, he was defeated both also in Russia, especially the Russian winter was said to defeat the French forces, and the large coalition was also able to defeat Napoleon. And then he was sent to exile in Elba, and at the end, he made a second effort, and there was a battle in Waterloo in today's Belgium, again between the British forces and French forces, and he finally lost the battle there, and that was the end of the Napoleonic era for France. So especially he had a wife called Josephine, and his relationship with Josephine was also very famous. It was the subject of many novels and movies, and Josephine was also seen as a very powerful figure who had a lot of influence on Napoleon. And there are also his philosophy, how he worked. For example, it was said that he didn't sleep much, but let's say, especially because he was very experienced in the battlefield. For example, he said, okay, I will sleep for 5 minutes. He was able to engage in a deep sleep for a very short period of time, and then he would just wake up all revitalized. So his manners, what he said, his philosophy, etc., was very much talked about throughout history. He became a quite influential figure. This also shows the political groupings in the French National Assembly, and this is also where the terms left and right in the political ideologies came from. So, in the National Assembly, the conservatives, which were pro monarchist, set to the right, while the revolutionaries, the Republicans, set in the National Assembly to the left. So they were in the left of the, let's say, chamber, the National Assembly. And from there, those who sat on the left were mostly Republicans, revolutionaries. They were for progress, they were for change. But those on the right were more traditionalist, conservatives, monarchists. So the way the direction they set in the National Assembly was attached to their ideologies, and hence we still use these terms, left wing, right wing, to denote the different ideologies in political systems around the world. So this is where they came from. They came from the sitting arrangement in the French National Assembly. In 1814, after the Napoleonic Wars and the Napoleonic era, we have the reinstatement of the monarchy. The Bourbon monarchy, the Bourbon dynasty, came back to the throne with Louis XVIII. And all the exiled aristocrats, statespeople, etc., they returned to France. And society was also badly split, badly fragmented. and between the right and the left, those who supported the monarchy, but those who were for a return to republicanism. Bonapartists also were quite still prominent. However, we still see that the effects of the French Revolution, the effects of the Enlightenment were still very much on the agenda in French society. Then we have an uprising against the king and the establishment of the Second Republic in 1848, which engaged in a series of liberal reforms, so engaging in a widening of freedoms, political participation, and political representation in the society. At the same time, the 1848 revolutions influenced many countries in Europe, and an era of liberalization in the political sphere came after these 1848 revolutions. However, this was quite short-lived in the case of France, and in 1852 we have the Second Empire established under Louis Napoleon, who said that he was the nephew of the former Napoleon Bonaparte. So he wanted to maybe capitalize on the charisma, on the historical significance of Napoleon Bonaparte. And during that time, there was a very high pace of modernization and industrialization in French society. In 1870, Prussia attacked France, and there was a war, a battle between Prussia that wanted to unify the Germanic principalities and France lost the war against Prussia, and the Alsace region in the north of France was taken by the Germans. This was also a region where there was a very high percentage of people who spoke German, so culturally it was close to Germany, and this region now belonged to Germany. And during that time, there was also a short experience of the Paris Commune when citizens in the Paris region actually created a very communist sort of experiment with self-rule. They established the Paris Commune. However, it was at the end crushed by the army, and several thousand people were actually killed during this the repression of the Paris Commune. In 1871, just after this loss of the war against Prussia, we have the establishment of the Third Republic, and this is an experience with liberal parliamentary democracy. Here we have the developments towards secularization, the separation of the state and the church. However, during this time, although we have the establishment of political parties, increasing political representation, political organization being established, it was also a quite unstable period. There were also still the social tensions that continued throughout the 19th century, also were influential in this period as well. And also in terms of modernization and industrialization, there was maybe a sort of a competition between Germany and France was a bit left behind because Germany engaged in a high level of industrialization. They were trying to catch up with the former colonial powers, especially Britain and also France, and France was left behind in this race. And they were also quite angry against the Germans because they lost territory to the Germans, and there was what was called as a revanchism. They wanted to take revenge from the Germans, and they wanted to regain the territory that was lost in 1870. And during this period, the First World War was fought. Also, France was also one of the countries that engaged in the First World War. So they were one of the winning, let's say, countries. However, in terms of human life, in terms of soldiers, in terms of economic and social consequences, they suffered as a result of the First World War. It was said that 1.5 million people actually died during the First World War. Second World War. Then in 1940, we have again an occupation by the Nazis, by Germany, and an interim sort of government was formed, which was not, the center was not in Paris, but in a provincial town in the south of France, Vichy, and it was called as the Vichy government. In order to prevent any attacks against French territory, there was a line which was created, sort of like an obstacle in front of any invading armies, the Maginot Line in the northeast of the country, and they thought that this would be enough to protect the country, defend the country against any invasion. However, it was not enough to actually stop the German army. The German army was able to basically surpass the Maginot Line. And they were invaded the north of the country, and in the south there was a new regime, the Vichy regime, which was established, which was in collaboration with the Nazis. However, there was also a sort of an unofficial resistance movement. They were trying to sabotage the Germans. They were trying to organize the civilians, let's say, to engage in some attacks against the Nazis or their military vehicles or their soldiers, etc. And General de Gaulle was the national hero of the time. He was the leader of the French government in exile. He didn't collaborate with the regime, and he was against the German invasion. He thought that France should actually fight against the Germans and not really engage in a sort of a collaboration with the Nazis, as the Vichy regime had done. And he said France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. So he kept up his morale, and he thought that this will not be the end of France, but France will again will win actually at the end of this Second World War. In 1947, the Fourth Republic was established, and the Fourth Republic was again a parliamentary regime. It was a quite a democratic parliamentary regime, but there was a lot of problems in stability of the regime. So a phenomenon which was called as immobilism emerged, because there was a high number of political groups in the parliament, and none of the political parties or none of the political leaders were able to assume a prominent majority in the parliament. So this meant that it was very difficult for governments to stay for a longer period of time. So there were consecutive governments, very frequent change of coalition parties, coalition governments, and the parliament was not really very functioning very properly. The executive was quite weak, and none of the governments were able to really achieve a strong, let's say, rule over the country. However, in this period, what was achieved was long-term economic planning, because the Second World War was very harsh on France as well. There was maybe both loss of lives, also loss of economic resources. So there was a need for a recovery of the country, and this was done through long-term economic planning. An economic planning unit was established, and Jean Monnet became the person who was responsible for this long-term economic planning. At the same time, for French, the empire was being lost. So a lot of territories which were important parts of the French empire were being lost. Indochina was being lost. France suffered a very humiliating defeat against the local forces in Indochina in 1954. So they had to withdraw from there. And also Algeria was seen as a part of France. However, there was also an independence movement starting in Algeria, and the French wanted to also suppress this independent movement by also engaging in what was a very harsh tactics against the pro-independence people in Algeria. However, at the end they were forced to leave Algeria, so they withdrew also from Algeria. In 1958, the French army units that were stationed in Algeria started a coup d'etat in 1958. So they started this in Algeria, and what they aimed at was to gain control of the whole of France. So they wanted to also fly to France, and they were also planning to land in France and to gain control of the country, because they thought that there was no actually rule over the country, there was no effective authority in the country. During the Fourth Republic, another important maybe success, despite the immobilism and this lack of stability, was the construction of the European communities, and France played a quite important role. At the beginning, we had the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 being established, and this was an idea maybe which was also supported by the Germans and also supported by the Americans, but still the architects were French. The head of the French Planning Commission, Jean Monnet, was actually the founder, let's say, the father of this initiative, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Robert Schuman, became the person who made a call to other West European countries to engage, to come together with France and establish this European Coal and Steel Community. Then in 1957, we had the establishment of the European Economic Community and European Atomic Energy Community. So together, these three communities established the European Community, which became the basis of today's European Union. However, there is also another episode in 1954 where we see another idea which was again propagated by France, now defeated in the French National Assembly. This was the idea of establishing a European defense community, which would mean the establishment of a common European army with common European foreign policies, common European security policies. However, it was not seen as a feasible, effective policy, and it was rejected in the National Assembly. So, mostly in the economic realm, an European integration process started, and France played an important role in this process. In 1958, we have the establishment of the Fifth Republic, and the architect of the Fifth Republic was mostly General Charles de Gaulle, who we talked about headed the provisional government, the French government in exile in London during the Second World War. He was seen as a national hero. He entered Paris when Paris was liberated by the Allied forces. And then after he returned to Paris, he criticized the Fourth Republic. He thought that there should be a new regime which would be based on a strong executive role. So he actually retreated in a provincial town, and he didn't take part in politics during the time of the Fourth Republic. However, because of the coup d'etat attempt, there was a search for a new political leader who would save the regime, who would save France, and he was invited to lead the new government. He came back to the capital, but he had one condition. He said that the Fourth Republic, this system cannot be governed, so if you want me to rule the country, if you want me to save the country from instability, then I will change the constitution. I will change the regime of the country. So he was given support by the political parties and the other the assembly as well. And a new constitution was declared. So with the new constitution came the Fifth Republic. So it was called as the Fifth Republic, and it was the basis was a semi-presidential system. Charles de Gaulle, a very prominent leader of France, started his government as the president of France in 1958 until 1969. So for a quite long period, he was heading France. And at the end, after the labor and student movements in 1968, he was forced to resign over a scandal that he couldn't really contain. When we look at the again the political traditions that also influenced the Fifth Republic, we can talk about radical republicanism, Bonapartism, and traditional right. Radical republicanism is basically rejecting the old order, rejecting all kinds of authority, and establishing the basis of a regime which would be progressive, which would respect rights and citizenship. Bonapartism is mostly related to the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. So those may be political movements mostly favored. Also, like de Gaulle, a strong leader, a strong executive that is able to govern the country and also lead the country with a very strong executive role. Then we have the traditional right, which are more conservative. For example, we have the Catholic royalists who are still supporting maybe a return to monarchy. Maybe at the moment we don't really have them maybe much, but especially in the 1950s, 60s, they were still relevant. Then we have another movement which was called as Boulangism, started in the 1950s, and then it led to a Pujadist movement. So this is a movement which is a more provincial movement supported by artisans, shopkeepers, and farmers. So it was we can also say that, for example, National Front, the ultra right wing party by Le Pen, started by Le Pen, and then now his daughter is continuing the party. So it is mostly a reactionary movement based in the provinces against elites, against the traditional bureaucracy, state structure of the society, and they are very also suspicious of globalization. They are suspicious of multinational companies. They are more protective against change, suspicious and quite skeptical about change. In terms of national identity, again, we see that the nationhood is very political. It is based on either, as we said, Republican idea or more conservative ideas or political opinions. It is state induced, so the relationship with the state or how you want to see the state is a very much important part of national identity and your approach to being French. As we said, there is a lot of fragmentation and it is a conflict ridden and divisive concept. Nation and state are closely intertwined because nation building process is also very much linked with the state building, goes in tandem with the state building process. So it's very difficult to differentiate between the state and the nation. They are very closely intertwined. At the end of the 19th century, both the national integration process, also state building process, was very much influenced by mass schooling, military conscription, and railway revolution. So even the provinces, even the parts of France that were very much far away from the center and also maybe close to the influence of the center were now became part of this modernization process and state building process, and the state was able to influence these different parts of the country because of the especially the increasing technologies, the opening of new roads, railways. Now with railways, all state officials were able to travel much more frequently, and the state was able to organize in these provinces of the country and exert its influence in these provinces. So it was more difficult now for the provinces to retain a specific and separate identity. And military conscription was very important. So the army, the people's army, so to speak, became also an area, a place where these ideas of the nation were propagated, a socialization process to being French and being proud French were also instigated in the military establishment, and also mass schooling was very important. And now the especially in primary schools and later on in the lycees, in the high schools, people were again socialized, internalizing the norms and values of the French Republic. So this nation building process was also quite important. There was also a very important book by historian Eugène Weber, and the name of the book was Peasants into Frenchmen. So he was talking about a period where change was imminent in France and a very fast pace of modernization could be felt. This was the period between 1870 and 1914, mostly the era just before the First World War. And he was talking about how people living in the countryside, how people mostly living off the land engaged in agricultural activity, but mostly subsistence agriculture, how these people were turned into Frenchmen, how they were socialized into being part of the French identity, part of the French nation. And he described in his book how roads, railways, and the school system transformed the countryside and attached the provinces, the countryside, to the center, to the political center of the country. During the Fifth Republic, again, we have a rapid urbanization and industrialization process continuing. Also, of course, the importance of the European integration and European communities was felt during this process. A national identity became more consensual compared to the previous periods. Cultural standardization became more prominent because now there are a lot of means also to do that, radio, newspapers, mass schooling, also television during that era. Increasing legitimacy of the regime can also be observed. And France also attained a predominant role in Europe and became one of the locomotives, let's say, of the European communities together with Federal Republic of Germany. In 1968, we have the student revolts, and here we have especially a period of turmoil, which also led to the resignation of Charles de Gaulle, the national hero. We have Pompidou replacing Charles de Gaulle as the president of the country, and this was a period of change when, again, people were very critical of the elite structures, of the hierarchical structures of the society, and they wanted more freedom, they wanted peace, they wanted change, not only in their country but in the world as a whole. So it was a process which included and which affected many countries in Europe, in the United States, and all over the world. So it was based on a labor movement, but also students collaborated and supported this movement. So it was more maybe a left wing, we can say, ideology influencing this movement, propagating for more equality, more reforms, an end to hierarchy, and end to the, let's say, conservative or authoritarian structures, more democracy, more freedom, more peace in the world. We talked about the semi presidential system during the Fifth Republic, and we see that it was a semi presidential system. When we talk about a semi presidential system, of course, we are talking about a system which includes and embodies both features of parliamentary systems and presidential systems. So it is different from the type of presidential system that we see in the United States. For example, the clear division of powers that we see in the case of the United States is different, does not exist in this semi-presidential system. Since the French Revolution, it is said that France has actually changed its constitution 15 times. So there is a high rate of change, and it's very different from the British tradition, of course. So in Britain, we said that there is a step-by-step approach, and we don't have one single document which is constitutes the constitution of Britain, but we have a number of traditions, we have a number of decrees, and we have a number of legal acts, laws, which make up the constitution of the country. But it is very, very evolutionary. So it builds one upon the other, and there are no abrupt changes, there are no breaks. But in this system, we let's say, have one constitution, then we are no longer satisfied with the constitution, so we can change it. So it's a mentality where changing constitutions is easier, and there are some abrupt changes in the system through these constitutions. Again, during the Fifth Republic, we said that one important aim in establishing a semi-presidential system was to avoid the immobilism of the Fourth Republic. And we have a directly elected president since 1963. This is called also an executive president because it is no longer just a symbolic function, but it is a political office that directly engages in the government of the country. And in addition, we have a prime minister. So it is also different from the current regime in Turkey, because here we have an executive presidency, but we don't have any prime minister. We have a cabinet which is directly linked under the presidency, but here we have, let's say, a sharing of power between the president and the prime minister. Especially de Gaulle made frequent use of referendums. So he said, okay, if I have to make an important decision, I will ask the people. I can directly relate with the people. I can ask them, and if the majority says yes, then I can go with it. So he gained a part of his legitimacy from this direct link with the people and the frequent use of referendums. President, as we said, is a powerful figure and engages directly in the executive function in the government, and also in times of imminent threat, in times of danger, president may also invoke emergency powers. So under these powers, the president can rule by decree, and it is provided in Article 16 of the Constitution. Here we see a chart, a quite detailed chart, which gives us an idea about how the system operates. We have a constitutional council, which is like a court of constitution, which actually gives judgments about the appropriateness, suitability of legislative acts to the constitutional principles. So it is like a judiciary authority which protects the constitution for the country. Then we have the National Assembly and the Senate, which makes up the parliament, the legislative function, and we have the government, the prime minister, and the ministers. But the president of the republic is also above the government, appoints the prime minister. We also have a Conseil d'Etat, which is also, let's say, an organ which actually gives, let's say, its opinion, its recommendations regarding the political system, the organization of the political structure. Then we have the citizens electing both the National Assembly, the Parliament, and also the government and the president of the country. Since de Gaulle, there have been some changes to the constitution. First of all, during de Gaulle's era, the president ruled for a period of 7 years, and it could be renewed indefinitely. But this has been changed, and now president's term of office is reduced to 5 years rather than 7 years, and the president can only be elected twice. So this provides some sort of limit on the presidential power, and we also see that. After 1986, there was a change, because until that time, the president and the prime minister and the cabinet were mostly of the same political party. So this meant that the president had a lot of influence over the prime minister, and there was more harmony between these two offices. However, in 1986, we had a very strange or maybe difficult situation where we had a socialist president together with a conservative majority parliament. So this meant that the prime minister came from a more Gaullist conservative background, while the president Mitterrand came from a socialist background from the Socialist Party. So it was this when the president and prime minister are from different parties and from rival, not very close political parties, then this sort of let's say happening, this sort of phenomena was called as cohabitation, living together, the different political parties and leaders of different political parties living together in this arrangement relationship, one the president, the other the prime minister. And they are from opposing political parties, and this created the question of how they will share the powers. So who will be responsible from which policy area, and when there's a disagreement, who will actually adjudicate? Will it be the president? But if the president takes care of everything, then what use will there be for the prime minister? So some sort of a compromise was maybe, let's say, devised out of this cohabitation. So it was said there is a duo in foreign policy. So there is a sharing of responsibility in foreign policy, while maybe the president was more powerful and more prominent in the foreign policies of the country. However, the prime minister was mostly more focused on domestic policy, especially on economic policy. And it was said there is a dual in domestic policy, where sometimes the president and prime minister's priorities conflicted with each other. So this created a conflict, a duel in domestic policy. However, in this realm, in the realm of domestic policy, mostly it was what the prime minister said and how he wanted to implement the policies, which was more important. So it was like a division of responsibilities. President more prominent in foreign policy and prime minister more powerful, more prominent in domestic policy. And then after this cohabitation process was maybe becoming more familiar for the society and for the political class, we have what we may call as a normalization of cohabitation. We had periods of such cohabitation between Mitterrand and Chirac. Then we had it with Mitterrand and Balladur, again from opposing parties. And then now we had a Gaullist President Chirac after 1997, together with a socialist prime minister, Jospin, Lionel Jospin, until 2002. So here we have Chirac, the president, and Sarkozy, who was the later president of the country, and the prime minister on the left. Again, there have been a series of reforms since 2000. First of all, as we said, reduction of the president's term of office to 5 years, and also another important, let's say, change, which also maybe ended this process of cohabitation, was that parliamentary elections were more or less concomitant with the presidential elections. Parliamentary elections are held 1 month after presidential elections. So in this way, it was made sure that the president and the prime minister are from the same party, because mostly people votes were more or less similar when they voted for the parliamentary in the parliamentary elections and in the presidential elections. Of course, this is no guarantee, but usually afterwards it was seen that they were mostly from the same party. So this made working together easier between the president and the prime minister. When we look at the party system, we can talk about a multi-party system, not the two-party system that we have talked about in Britain. We have center-right, center-left parties, also four-right, four-left parties, and also some parties, smaller parties, that have emerged from these mainstream parties, what are called as splinter parties. Parties, basically, let's say some groups in the main party forming smaller parties. They just break away from the main parties. Electoral system is also quite important and in a way responsible for this conglomeration of the political party system. It is, in terms of the parliamentary elections, it is what is described as a single member district system based on majority of votes. More than 50 of the votes needed, for example, for a candidate to be elected in a district to represent the people in the National Assembly. He or she should win at least 50% and more of the votes. But for example, in the British system, it's just a plurality of the votes. But in this system, it's majority of the votes. If none of the candidates can get more than 50%, then elections are repeated between the top two candidates or those with at least 12.5% of the vote. So there is a second contest, a second electoral contest continuing. In the presidential elections, there are two rounds of elections every 5 years. So first, there is the first round, let's say, where you have multiple elections, both from the mainstream, center-right, center-left, far-right, far-right. And then the top two candidates enter into a second round of elections. And the one receiving the largest vote is elected as the president of the country. When we look at the main political parties, we have the Les Républiques En Marche, that is actually Macron's party. It's a center liberal and pro-European party. It is mostly for liberal reforms, supporting, let's say, liberal trade, open capital flows, etc. It's mostly center, we can say. Then we have the Republican Party, formerly Union for a Popular Movement and Rally for the Republic. Mostly this is more conservative and mostly Gaullist, strong executive, supporting a strong executive role. Then we have the Socialist Party. It now has about 30 seats, a social democrat, a social liberal agenda, but it was more powerful in the days of Mitterrand in the 1980s and 90s, but it has lost a bit of power during the recent era. Then we have other parties, Democratic Movement, center to center right. It has 42 seats at the moment. Then we have the French Communist Party, which is far left. It was quite important party, especially among the intellectuals during the Cold War era, and it had quite strong links with the Soviet Union also during that era. Then we have the National Front, far-right populist and Eurosceptic party. It is against migrants. It is against Muslim migrants, especially. It is a nativist party, very much supporting French national identity against any sort of integration with the European Union. So it is a Eurosceptic party, and at the moment it has 8 seats in the parliament. This is, let's say, a map which shows the results of the 2017 elections. And here we have Macron gaining the largest number of votes with 23.9% of the votes. Then we have Le Pen, the second contender, about 21% of the votes. Then we have Fillon Mélenchon, 19.9% and 19.6%, followed by other let's say candidates. So there was quite a short gap or a low level of difference between Macron and Le Pen. Le Pen gained also quite, especially mostly, let's say, reactionary votes went to Le Pen. And this is the result of the second round. Here again, there were only 2 candidates, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. And some of the other candidates also, let's say, they said, okay, my supporters can send their votes, can now vote this candidate. I support this candidate. So they show direction for the second round of elections. And here there is a much larger difference because it's now 2 candidates only. And some of the other supporters of the other candidates voted for Macron. So Marine Le Pen's vote did not change. However, Macron collected a lot of votes from other political groups, political leaders as well. So he gained 44% and was elected as the president. And also we have 25% abstention, which is also quite a high number. So some people refused actually to vote, and 9% was what we may call as invalid also votes. This is also quite a large number. Prime Minister and Cabinet. President selects the Prime Minister, Premier, who then picks ministers, and Prime Minister is usually from the majority party in the Assembly. The President cannot directly fire the Prime Minister, so the Prime Minister has autonomy from the President, and because his also authority rests on the majority in the National Assembly, and Parliament also can censure the government and has some form of control over the government. National Assembly is the main legislative body made up of 577 members. It is elected every 5 years, and the cabinets are not really made by the National Assembly. The Prime Minister forms the government in consultation with the President, and the members of the cabinet may or may not be members of the National Assembly, so they may come from outside the National Assembly, but if they are also members of the National Assembly, they have to resign before they take their offices in the government as cabinet ministers. The National Assembly, as we said, can censure a cabinet, and the president also has the power to dissolve the National Assembly for new elections. So they can say, okay, I am dissolving the National Assembly, but if the president does that, then new elections should be held, and there are limits to this power, how much or how many times the president can actually use this power. And most of the legislative bills are made, of course, prepared by by the government, but in collaboration between the prime minister and the president. So the government works in close cooperation with the president, and most laws can also be passed by decrees, by governmental decrees. There is also an upper house, so it is usually what we find in federal states. There are two houses. In France, the same structure is also maintained. So we have lower house and upper house, but upper house has less authority, is less important. It is made up of 326 members elected every 9 years, but every 3 years, 1/3 of the Senate is elected. So there is a constant, every 3 years, renewal, let's say, of the Senate. It is elected by an electoral college made up of deputies of the National Assembly and also regional and municipal councillors. So it also represents the provinces. Maybe that's a more, let's say, it is also said that the provinces are more represented in the Senate. It is also called as the agricultural chamber because of its sensitivity over provincial agricultural issues, may amend government bills, but National Assembly can override its objections, the Senate's objections, by a simple majority. Since the 1980s, again, we are maybe witnessing some problems in the political establishment in France. First of all, unemployment has become an important problem. Neoliberal transformation has challenged the state, especially the state's prominent role in the economy. So it was very difficult to follow the economic logic of France, the state-induced logic of French economy. Immigration has provided a challenge and created some objection in the society, especially in the sort of the banlieue, the outskirts of the cities. There is now more immigrants there, and there are also some clashes, ethnically based clashes there. It also fueled the rise of the new right. The new right based its identity mostly as being against immigration, against immigrants. Cohabitation was also important, as we talked about. We also heard a lot of corruption scandals, which created a loss of faith in politics, especially, for example, in even Sarkozy's era, when Nicolas Sarkozy was the president. There were also some scandal which emerged over some illegitimate or illegal dealings with some companies such as L'Oreal, for example. Putting ethical standards into the political system became an important priority. Here we have Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the National Front, and then he was replaced by his daughter Marine Le Pen. And Marine Le Pen also has been a leader which continues the legacy, but she has also adopted some of the modern, let's say, approaches of the political system. So she also became maybe a voice which talked about the grievances of the population in French society, especially economic problems like unemployment, low social skills, social standards, etc. And the immigrants were used as scapegoats, maybe. Most of these problems were also seen as a side effect of increasing immigration. So she very maybe shrewdly also manipulated the misgivings and the problems in the society, and she used it to increase the popularity of the party, National Front National. Fragmenting party system. Traditionally, it was described as a bipolar quadrille. So it was like there were four major parties. It was mostly from the left and the right. So on the left we had Communist Party and Socialist Party. On the right we had Gaullist, Assembly of the Republic, Union for a Popular Movement, and we have Giscardians, Union for French Democracy. So they were more or less together, but let's say they were mostly on the right, but they had less important differences among each other. In the 1980s, we begin to see differences in the party system. The socialists became more prominent with the rise of Mitterrand. François Mitterrand became the president of the country. The National Front also began to rise at the same time, began to gain in prominence. And also we begin to see new parties, which were splinter parties from the mainstream parties. There has been there has been a higher rate of governmental turnover, and as we said, corruption scandals and loss of confidence in the legitimacy and the effectiveness of the political establishment in France. Um, Mostly, as we said, the far right in France had mostly an anti-EU, Eurosceptic, and anti-immigration agenda. When we look at their constituency, who supports this party, we mostly see reactionary lower middle classes, some working class notes, ultra-conservative Catholics, and ethnically mixed urban suburbs, the banlieue that we talked about. There are also people who are uneasy about living with immigrants, uneasy about the cultural variety surrounding them, and they think that their, let's say, economic resources are also being shared with the immigrants, and they are very critical of pro-immigration policies, pro-EU policies. We also see some attempts. We also talked about France as being a very centralized sort of structure, a centralized administration state, mostly basing its power on the central administration. In 1982, together with the Defer laws, we see a territorial decentralization process for more effective management. We see a process of decentralization. At the same time, what is called as juridicization was also experienced during this era, where the Constitutional Council became a prominent part of the political structure. It attained a central role in the political structure, and, for example, legislative, let's say, bills were now checked and controlled by the Constitutional Council in order to see and evaluate whether they were in line with the constitutional procedure, constitutional requirements. So this gave to the judiciary, it gave new powers to the judiciary. Then we have also investigating magistrates, also trying to put some regulatory and judicial control on governmental action. So they are trying to see whether there is any corruption, whether there is any mismanagement of funds or mismanagement of authority in governmental positions. So there are some controlling institutions, some judicial control over the executive structure. Again, we have already said that France has a very prominent role in European integration. However, with the ending of the Cold War, we see a decline in France's international position, a decline in the determining influence of France, especially during the Cold War era. We mostly talked about a duopoly in European integration between France and Germany. While Germany was the economic powerhouse, France was the political leader, and they formed a very close alliance in pushing forward for the integration process. However, with the ending of the Cold War, Germany was reunited, and it was able to re-establish its powerful position at the center of Europe. The eastern enlargement of the European Union also provided a new prestige, new power for Germans, and this meant maybe that there was a relegation of power for France. It was now maybe relegated to a secondary power position in European integration, and it was said that, especially with the new policies, economic logic, the neoliberal logic, France was becoming an importer of policies and institutions. So this was like the end of exceptionalism, whether or not France was able to hold on to its specificities, or whether it was no longer able to resist against this change and the global pressures on France, both on the state, economy, and society. There is growing resistance, growing liberalization, and this contrasted, especially this neoliberal doctrine, and also the policies in the euro area, which were more in line with Germany's principles, Germany's priorities, contrasted with French dirigism, meaning a state-controlled economy where state has a lot of importance in allocating economic resources, in determining the positions of French industry, etc., French agriculture. So a very controlled and mostly interventionist economic role. However, in this liberal era, it became more and more difficult for France to continue with this role, with its specific character. And also the growing pressures from European integration and also globalization, the high pace of globalization, also clashed with notions of national sovereignty, the idea of the republic, the idea of the specificity of the French identity and French political institutions. They all came under increasing challenge in this new era. And the Europeanization and globalization, twin effects of these processes, reduced the autonomy of the state. The state now became an adapter to these outside pressures, and more and more the traditionally dirigist interventionist French state began to lose capacity of action, and this created also resentment in the society because it was no longer possible for the state to live up to its promises, the expectations of the society and its citizens. With the new President Macron, we have maybe a new revitalization of France, both in the EU and in the world, because Macron has been a figure mostly pro globalization, pro liberalism, pro European Union. So it was like France is now again in the play. It is intent on becoming one of the forces of the globalized era, one of the countries that will actually adapt itself to the changing circumstances and will play a powerful role in the international system. In the European Union, France reclaimed a leadership position. Macron became one of the most important defenders and proponents of reform in the EU, and he said that the EU should reform itself. The EU should reform its decision making. It should have a geostrategic perspective, otherwise it will not be meaningful in today's world. So he wanted a more powerful EU, a more effective EU, and for this to be achieved, he supported reforms in the EU decision making process. He wanted a European army, he wanted a stronger European economic and monetary union, and he brought up this agenda for reform of the EU. So this maybe increased France's importance again for EU and the world. However, Macron was also faced with some protests and resentment in his own society. He engaged in some reforms, in some liberal reforms. These caused resentment in the society, and a protest movement emerged spontaneously in different places in France, especially in the big cities in 2019. This was called the yellow vest because these people were wearing these yellow vests that were used in emergency situations. And these first protests were triggered by the imposition of an environmental tax on gasoline. The pretext for this tax was protecting the environment. However, these people said, "Oh, this is enough. We cannot take any more because we use our cars, for example, to go to work every day. So even a small increase in the cost of travel will hurt us badly. Our living standards have dropped. So we are barely making it. We are barely making a decent living for ourselves. So we cannot stand any longer." So it triggered a new process, and Macron was seen by these people as being very elitist, as not being really aware of what was going on in the middle classes, lower middle classes, what kind of pressures people were faced with, and what kind of problems they were having in continuing their daily lives, the loss of income, the problems in finding employment, etc. So it created a series of protests which continued, which were very difficult for the state to control. However, until now they are mostly subsided, we can say, because some of the reforms were delayed, some were withdrawn by the government, and very also police measures, security measures were also taken in order to control this process. So France is going through a quite difficult period. We have these actually very much also led to interruptions in the daily routine in major cities of France. The Yellow Vests, they made it known. However, until now, the Yellow Vests and their viewpoints, their ideologies could not really sustain a unified political movement because they are from different ideologies. There are left-wing people there are pro-National Front people there, all in the same protest movement because they have some common, let's say, grievances, common complaints, but other than that, they may have completely different worldviews. So until now, they were not able to really bring about a very common political agenda against the National Front or against Macron's more liberal political agenda. So thank you very much for listening.